It's no secret that as you move inwards from the poles towards the tropics, biodiversity tends to increase, resulting in some of the most colourful and awe-inspiring ecosystems on Earth. In ecology, this pattern is referred to as the latitudinal diversity gradient, and across the last few centuries, many of the greatest minds in natural science have wondered the same question. Why? It may seem like a simple question, but it's actually one of the biggest questions in ecology, and after hundreds of years of theorising, we seem to have only gotten further from agreeing. So naturally, it's high time for someone on YouTube to act like they belong in this debate. Now I of course can't give you a single definitive answer, so instead today we'll be going over the major current hypotheses and their criticisms, so you can be prepared for when your light-hearted dinner conversation next turns to the patterns surrounding species diversity. But before we get into that, first we need a bit of background information just to lay the groundwork. The part of the world that we call the Tropics sits between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, two latitude lines that mark the northern and southernmost points at which the sun could be seen directly overhead during the June and December solstices respectively. These lines aren't fixed positions, as cyclic variations and wobbles in the Earth's tilt mean they drift a little, but in the grand scheme of things, they're fairly constant, and between them you can find a wide and diverse range of habitats, from tropical rainforests to savannas and ice-capped mountains to scorching deserts, all found alongside almost all of the world's coral reefs and mangrove forests. In total, the tropics cover about 40% of the world's surface area, but around 78% of all known species can be found within them. This includes both species entirely endemic to this range, and also those that can be found outside of them, such as many migratory birds. And whether you're looking at terrestrial, freshwater or marine environments, you'll notice the majority of organisms follow the latitudinal diversity gradient. This effect is very pronounced in some taxonomic groups like corals and amphibians, while it's less obvious but still present in others such as marine birds. There are also several notable examples where diversity doesn't follow this general global trend, for example with voles, crayfish and conifer trees. We'll cover some of the problems with the gradient later in the video, but this trend is pervasive enough to be generally accepted in ecology. So on that note, I think it's high time we look into the potential reasons for it. The first group of hypotheses we'll cover today are perhaps the most obvious and the longest standing ones. The species richness is simply because of the climate. The tropics experience a high level of sunlight year-round, which facilitates plenty of plant growth and supports a higher level of living biomass. But of course plenty of sunlight alone isn't enough, otherwise the Sahara Desert would be as biodiverse as the Amazon. There are many other important metrics, both climatic and otherwise, that factor into the equation here, such as rainfall and nutrient availability, for instance. Combined with these factors to help support plant growth, a high level of sunlight results in a higher net primary productivity. This is simply just the amount of energy stored by the process of photosynthesis minus the energy used by the plants for their own needs. The higher this number is, the higher the amount of energy available for the rest of the food web to survive off of. So when these factors align perfectly, like in the Amazon, you're treated to a very high carrying capacity for the land. On the topic of climate, another theory instead focuses on the fact that these areas have less harsh seasons. Species in temperate regions typically need to handle both freezing winters and sweltering summers, while tropical regions rather just experience wet and dry seasons. This is most extreme in the polar circles of the Earth, where half of the year is in near complete darkness. Rather than having a constant supply of energy entering the ecosystem, life in these areas has had to adapt to just about survive these periods, typically by slowing their growth or metabolic processes down as much as possible, or in extreme cases even by completely freezing over. Plant life here doesn't get the chance to maintain a decent foothold, so the terrestrial ecosystems in the poles simply can't support the same level of biomass. Even though with the wet and dry seasons there are cycles of higher and lower productivity, resources in the tropics are generally still more predictable and consistent by comparison, possibly giving species more opportunity to specialise into smaller ecological niches. A big counterpoint to both of these climate arguments can be found in the rainforests, but not the tropical ones, rather the temperate rainforests of the world. Old-growth temperate rainforests are able to produce and store biomass at similar levels of efficiency to tropical ones, but significantly more species can be found in the tropical rainforests. And so this raises the point that while the net primary productivity of these rainforests could explain the number of individuals in these ecosystems, it doesn't necessarily explain the number of species. Put simply, speciation occurs when gene flow is restricted over a very long period of time through the accumulation of natural mutations. For example, say you split a group of fruit flies into two separate populations. You then feed them on two different types of food and keep them apart for many generations. When you mix them again, they may have developed different courtship displays or may not even be physically able to mate together at all. If the flies from those two groups can no longer produce viable offspring, they have become two separate species. You could argue that if you were to assume a uniform level of mutation, a higher number of individuals would simply result in a higher frequency of genetic mutations, and hence a higher level of speciation. But there's likely more at play here, or we would expect to see closer levels of biodiversity across both of these ecosystems. Although they're not on the same level as tropical rainforests, temperate rainforests are still hotspots of biodiversity, despite being in locations that experience both hot and cold seasons. There are also many examples of ecosystems with stable climates that don't have a high biodiversity, such as many mountaintops found in the tropics, and marine ecosystems aren't impacted by seasons in the same way, despite also following the gradient. So yet again, while the stability could be a factor, it can't possibly be the sole reason. Another group of theories suggests that this richness is not necessarily because of the current climate, but rather it's a result of historical factors. Excluding recent human impacts, temperate regions have gone through massive amounts of change throughout the ages. Vast forested areas rose up and died off to become grasslands. Entire ecosystems completely froze over and thawed again and again. And yet, while the tropics were of course impacted by the ice ages, they were likely comparatively stable, and climatic changes that caused mass extinctions elsewhere may have been more manageable in tropical regions. As the ice sheets expanded, they may have forced most temperate life to either retreat to the tropics or go extinct, meaning that once the ice sheets contracted again, that life would have to recolonize these areas. This would of course mean that species in tropical regions have simply had more time to evolve and diverge, resulting in a higher biodiversity which would still persist in today's world. This theory shifts a little from the climate-focused ones in that it assumes temperate ecosystems are depleted and likely still recovering from the last ice age, rather than being at their maximum carrying capacity, which is just the maximum population size that can be sustained by the resources of an environment. But while this could explain a diversity gradient across land, again it does largely fail to explain why there's a gradient across marine ecosystems, which likely wouldn't have been impacted by the ice ages in the same way as the land. The biggest problem with these history-focused hypotheses is simply a lack of evidence, as while we can infer things from a mixture of scientific models, fossils and geological records, we of course can't be completely sure as to their accuracy. Unless someone develops time travel, but then we'll probably have better things to do than see how cold Brazil was a million years ago. So it's pretty safe to say there will always be some level of uncertainty in these theories. Within the tropics, you will typically find many species and clades that have been around for longer when compared to other latitudes, and this is likely because the tropics essentially act as both a nursery and a nursing home. It's generally accepted that the tropics have acted as a cradle for many new species to emerge from. It is worth noting that this isn't always the case. For example, penguins likely diverged in the southern hemisphere away from the equator, but fossil evidence suggests that the majority of species originated in the tropics. Of those, the vast majority would naturally remain in or around them, as they haven't evolved to be able to survive the colder climates found elsewhere, but some species would successfully expand outwards to colonize the temperate zones and diverge further from there. Included in the list of species that likely did this is a primate that would go on to wonder things like why is biodiversity higher in the tropics, as they break the last cave lion's skull open with a rock. As we covered earlier, the tropics generally have more resources available, but competition for those resources is often intense, especially in places like the tropical rainforests. This high level of competition may also result in a high level of speciation, as species are forced to adapt and find new little ecological niches to fit in and survive in these high-pressure ecosystems. With one small glimpse at a section of the Amazon rainforest, you'll notice countless more lianas, epiphytes and parasitic plants than you'd find in a temperate rainforest, simply because they've had to adapt to the intense competition for ground space, light and nutrients. You could definitely argue that this is all just a symptom of other causes rather than a cause itself, but you could also argue that this is a factor that helps to maintain the high biodiversity in these areas. On the other end of this point, extinction rates tend to be lower in the tropics than the rest of the world, which would be the perfect explanation for the gradient, if we hadn't basically just rephrased the question to why are extinction rates lower in the tropics. This point is often particularly controversial, as many argue extinction rates are indeed very high in the tropics, but assuming a model without any human impacts, speciation likely exceeds the rate of extinction far more here than it does in temperate or polar regions. But the availability of data is an even bigger problem here than with other theories, as so much of the world remains understudied and so many species haven't been formally described, so it's hard to make blanket statements on these sorts of things like the rates of extinction until we know more. The final hypothesis we'll cover today delves more into the realm of maths than ecology, and that is the mid-domain effect. Put simply, if you randomly arrange species across an area of land and factor in their ranges, they would naturally most overlap towards the centre, which would be a frustratingly easy explanation to come across after I read so many papers when researching this video. Fortunately for my own well-being, it's probably the most controversial and polarising of the ones I've mentioned today, so nobody has wasted their time here. These models are far from perfect, but the theory remains despite that. Some argue that this simple effect may at least play a part in the gradient, while others largely dismiss it as something that only really works in a vacuum. But one thing everyone agrees on is that currently it's hard to say how accurate the simulated effect is to the real world. A big problem with uncovering the reasons behind the latitudinal diversity gradient is that simply we don't have enough information. Many areas in the tropics remain data scarce, including entire types of ecosystems like tropical grasslands and dry forests that desperately need more study. And even beyond that, we also need to better understand temperate and polar ecosystems to fully uncover how pervasive this pattern really is. Essentially, we need to somehow map the biodiversity and distributions of everything across the entire planet, from the tallest mountains to the deepest oceans. If you didn't see how answering this question was a problem before, I'm sure you do now. This is still fairly new, but there's also evidence that while diversity in terms of species is higher in the tropics, the occurrence of subspecies is actually higher in the temperate regions. Species in the tropics tend to have smaller ranges and populations when compared to temperate species, which may well explain this effect. But it also means that while the rate of extinction may naturally be lower in the tropics, the current risk of extinction for many species is far higher. You could cut down a hectare of rainforest and there may have been a species that was entirely endemic to that area. In the coldest and most detached possible takeaway from that, that means data is being lost constantly. Data that could hold the key to understanding both this problem and countless others that we face across science as a whole. So, this emphasises the importance of not only research, but also conservation. We've been working on this side of things since 2017, and recently in the tropics we've begun trialling coral restoration in Indonesia and purchased almost 200 hectares of rainforest in Ecuador to conserve and study this unique habitat with the help of the local people. We are 100% funded by our members and couldn't undertake any of these projects without them, so if you're interested in learning more and maybe supporting our work, you can find out more on our website at mossy.earth. If that feels like too much of a commitment right now, supporting us on here by liking and subscribing helps out too, and is all very much appreciated. I feel the latitudinal diversity gradient is the perfect example of how little we really understand our planet. As while we may recognise the surface pattern, the underlying processes and reasons are basically left to educated guesses. The answer likely lies in a combination of these theories and maybe more, so while I unfortunately can't send you away with one definitive answer, hopefully you now feel more informed about the potential answers. The debate will rage on in a civil and formal way, but until new conclusive evidence arises, that's likely how it will remain. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you next time when we'll be delving into the hotly debated topic of de-extinction. Cheers.